Hey there, survivors. It's David here. Thanks for tuning in to tonight's episode. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. It really helps me keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, let's get started. Thanks for stopping by. When our channel reaches 1,000 subscribers, we're launching a lottery giveaway. And one new subscriber will win an iPhone 17 Pro Max. Subscribe now and be in the race before it's too late. By the time I reached the perimeter of the emergency complex, it had been 120 days since the outbreak began. I had stopped counting in the traditional sense weeks earlier, but the number stayed fixed in my mind because it marked the point at which structured survival became unsustainable. I had spent 4 months moving between abandoned distribution centers, highway rest stops, and one failed quarantine zone. The government facility had always been a distant option in the back of my mind, not because it promised safety, but because I had once helped review its infrastructure plans during a continuity exercise years earlier. I knew it existed. I knew roughly where it was. I did not know whether it was still functioning. The complex had been built into a low ridge beyond what used to be a restricted federal land boundary. From a distance, it resembled nothing more than a reinforced maintenance compound, surrounded by fencing and surveillance poles. As I approached, it was clear that whatever security presence once guarded it had dissolved early in the collapse. 2 vehicles were abandoned near the outer checkpoint, both doors hanging open, their interiors stripped. The fencing remained intact, but bodies lay along its perimeter, caught in the wire where they had pressed against it repeatedly. The remains were weeks old, partially decomposed and dried by exposure, which suggested that whatever surge had driven them there had passed through long before I arrived. I moved cautiously along the fence line until I reached the secondary service gate. The keypad housing had been damaged, but not destroyed. The official entrance would have required active credentials and internal clearance codes that I no longer possessed. The service gate, however, had once been programmed with a rotating override sequence for maintenance contractors. I had memorized that sequence during a compliance review exercise, not because I expected to use it, but because details like that stayed with me. The keypad powered on when I pressed it. That meant the complex still had power. I entered the override sequence slowly, half expecting the system to reject it after so many months without authorized resets. The panel flickered, paused, and then emitted a muted mechanical click. The inner gate disengaged. That was when I heard movement behind me. It was not wind, and it was not the dry shifting of bodies against fencing. It was a staggered, uneven approach across gravel. I turned just in time to see a single infected separating from the tree line 30 yards away. It moved without urgency, but with clear orientation, drawn either by sound or by my presence alone. I stepped inside the service corridor and pulled the gate closed behind me. The infected accelerated as the distance shortened. The fencing slowed it only briefly. By the time I reached the reinforced outer blast door that led into the interior security passage, it was already pressing against the wire with enough force to distort it. The outer door required a second authentication, this one biometric. Years ago, I had been granted temporary clearance for a systems audit, and though that clearance should have expired, the facility was likely operating in degraded mode. I pressed my palm against the reader. The scanner hummed longer than it should have. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the locking bolts disengaged. I slipped inside and sealed the door as the infected forced its way through a weakened section of fencing. The door closed with a hydraulic thud that reverberated down the corridor. Through the narrow, reinforced window, I watched the infected slam into the steel surface repeatedly before losing interest and turning back toward the tree line. The interior corridor lights were dim but functional. Emergency power mode, most likely. The air smelled filtered and mechanical, not decayed. That was the first sign that someone might still be alive inside. The complex had not been designed as a civilian refuge. It was a continuity facility, intended to preserve segments of government leadership during catastrophic events. Food stocks were calculated for limited personnel. Air systems were segmented by clearance zone. Access was hierarchical. I understood immediately that if the facility was still occupied, my presence would not be automatically welcomed. As I moved deeper into the security passage, I noticed dried blood along the wall near the secondary checkpoint. A security badge lay on the floor beside a collapsed chair. The inner access door had been forced partially open and then re-secured from the inside. That told me two things. There had been a breach, and someone had survived it. I proceeded slowly, aware that I was entering a system designed to seal itself against threats, not invite them in. If the people inside had survived 120 days, they would not be quick to trust an unfamiliar voice in their corridor. When I reached the second blast door, I heard the faint echo of movement from beyond it. Not infected movement, controlled, deliberate. The complex still had occupants, and I had just sealed myself inside it. The second blast door did not open immediately when I announced myself. I identified who I was and explained how I had accessed the outer corridor, keeping my voice level and measured. Inside a facility like this, tone mattered. Panic suggested instability. Overconfidence suggested deception. I chose clarity and waited. For nearly a minute, there was no response. Then, a voice came through the intercom speaker embedded in the wall to my left. It was a woman's voice, steady but tired, asking me to state my name again, and to explain my previous association with the complex. I repeated everything, including the audit exercise I had participated in years earlier. I mentioned specific systems, the segmented water filtration loop, and the redundant generator array, details that would be difficult to fabricate convincingly without prior access. There was another pause. Then the internal locking bolts disengaged in sequence. The door opened only halfway at first. A rifle barrel appeared in the gap before the rest of the room did. Behind it stood a man in a faded National Guard uniform, his posture careful but strained. He looked younger than I expected and older than his years at the same time. The injury in his left leg was immediately visible. He leaned slightly to one side, distributing weight unevenly. "Step forward slowly," he said. I complied without argument. He kept the rifle trained on me while another figure emerged from behind a console further inside the control area. She wore civilian clothing, but carried herself with clinical focus. Her expression was analytical rather than fearful. "I'm Dr. Lillian Rowe," she said after a moment. "If you're lying about clearance history, we'll know quickly." "That's fair," I replied. They searched me efficiently, removing the limited gear I carried and setting it aside. The interior checkpoint room had been converted into a hybrid operations station. Monitors displayed power distribution grids and internal corridor cameras. Several sections of the facility map were marked in red. "You came alone?" Dr. Rowe asked. "Yes. That's unusual at this stage. I stopped traveling with others after the third month," I said. "Groups attract attention." The soldier, he later introduced himself as Corporal Reyes, studied me carefully before lowering the rifle slightly. His face showed skepticism, but not hostility. Skepticism had likely kept them alive. They explained that the complex had been partially operational when the outbreak began. A small contingent of federal continuity staff and National Guard personnel had activated emergency protocols on day 2. By day 9, evacuation efforts for remaining officials had failed. Transport vehicles were overrun during departure attempts. A decision was made to seal the lower levels and conserve resources for those who remained. "How many?" I asked. "Initially 37, Dr. Rowe said. "And now?" She didn't answer immediately. Reyes did. 4. The number settled heavily in the room. 2 had died from injuries sustained during early breaches. Several others had attempted controlled exits for supply retrieval and never returned. Others succumbed to infection during an incident in Sublevel 4, a section of the facility that had housed research containment units. Sublevel 4 was sealed permanently after that event. The control room we stood in represented the upper operational tier of the complex. Food stores had been calculated for executive continuity scenarios lasting 30 days at full capacity. With reduced population and strict rationing, those supplies had stretched to 120 days, but not much further. Power was sustained by a rotating generator schedule supplemented by surface solar arrays, though panel efficiency had degraded due to lack of maintenance. Water filtration remained functional but unstable. One of the tertiary pumps had failed weeks earlier, forcing them to reroute flow through a less efficient system. "You understand infrastructure," Dr. Reyes said, studying me. "You can see the problem." "Yes," I said. "You're extending a design beyond its intended duration." She nodded once. The complex had not been meant for civilians like me, and it had not been meant for long-term habitation without external support. It was a temporary preservation structure built on the assumption that federal response would eventually re-establish control. That assumption had not held. Reyes gestured towards the corridor leading deeper into the facility. "We can't turn you away now that you're inside," he said. "But understand something clearly, we already sealed this place once from the inside. If we have to do it again, we will." I believed him. Dr. Reyes handed me a set of internal clearance tags repurposed from abandoned staff OEEDs. "You'll stay within marked zones until we reassess supply projections. No wandering, no noise in restricted corridors. And you don't go near Sublevel 4. "What's in Sublevel 4 now?" I asked. Reyes answered quietly. "What we couldn't contain." The air inside the complex felt stable, filtered, controlled. It was the first structured environment I had been inside in months, but it was not secure in the way I had imagined when approaching the perimeter. It was controlled instability, and I had just become part of its equation. The initial sense of relief I felt after being allowed inside the complex faded quickly once I began to understand the state of its systems. The facility had been engineered for continuity under short-term catastrophic conditions, not for prolonged isolation without external supply chains. It was built to preserve leadership, not to sustain an indefinitely sealed population. The design assumptions behind it had not anticipated a collapse that would stretch beyond a few structured weeks. Dr. Reyes walked me through the main operations corridor the morning after my arrival. The lighting was dimmer than it should have been, operating on reduced consumption cycles. Certain sections of the facility had already been decommissioned to conserve energy. Entire hallways were sealed behind reinforced partitions, marked clearly with red hazard strips and handwritten warnings. The generator system was the first vulnerability she showed me. The complex relied on 2 primary diesel units housed in a lower mechanical chamber and a series of secondary battery reserves. The diesel supply had originally been calculated to support approximately 1 month of full operation. With strict rotation schedules and aggressive power rationing, they had extended it 4 times longer than intended. Even so, fuel reserves were approaching a critical threshold. "We can't maintain full air circulation indefinitely," she explained. "We've been cycling sectors on timed intervals. Some areas receive filtered air every 6 hours instead of continuous flow. That creates pressure differentials," I said. She nodded. "Which is why we've sealed off 2 wings entirely." The water filtration system presented a similar concern. One of the tertiary pumps had failed 40 days earlier due to seal degradation. Replacement parts were stored in a separate mechanical annex that had been compromised during an early breach. They had improvised a rerouting solution, but the load strain on the remaining pumps was measurable. Reyes joined us near the central monitoring station, limping slightly as he leaned against the console. His injury had occurred during that breach, one of the first times infected had penetrated the internal perimeter. He described how a group of security personnel returning from a supply retrieval mission had unknowingly carried contamination into a mid-level access point. The infected response had been immediate and chaotic. Several personnel were lost before the internal blast doors could be resealed. That's when Sublevel 4 went dark, he said quietly. I studied the facility schematic displayed on the monitor. Sublevel 4 extended deeper than the primary living quarters, originally designated for secure research and classified storage. The entire section had been locked down, isolating both infected personnel and remaining staff who had been unable to reach the upper levels in time. They're still down there, Reyes added. Confirmed? I asked. Movement sensors trip occasionally, he said. We don't investigate. The complex was not only sustaining structural fatigue, it was housing active threat zones within its own containment grid. As I reviewed the energy distribution logs, I noticed irregular spikes during overnight cycles. What's this fluctuation? I asked. Dr. Rowe hesitated before answering. Ventilation compensation. When air circulation reduced in sealed wings, pressure variance sometimes forced automated corrections in adjacent corridors. The system was compensating for imbalances, drawing slightly more power than optimal. It was a subtle inefficiency, but over time, subtle inefficiencies compound. How long do you realistically have? I asked. She met my eyes without defensiveness. If nothing else fails, perhaps 3 weeks. 3 weeks inside a structure already stretched beyond its intended capacity. The psychological toll was evident in small details. Supplies were organized with precision bordering on rigidity. Meal portions were calculated down to individual caloric requirements. Noise discipline was strict in corridors adjacent to sealed sections. Even conversation was often conducted in lower tones than necessary. Adrian Kessler, the fourth survivor, emerged from the engineering bay while we were reviewing water diagnostics. He had worked as a civilian contractor during portions of the complex's construction years earlier and had remained on site during the initial outbreak to assist with system transitions. His familiarity with mechanical infrastructure had kept the facility operational longer than it otherwise would have. It wasn't designed for this, he said, gesturing towards the dim corridor. It was designed to buy time. And time didn't buy recovery, I replied. He shook his head slightly. Time bought isolation. The distinction mattered. Every system inside the complex was functioning, but functioning in degraded mode. Every redundancy was being consumed without replacement. Every sealed section represented both protection and loss. The infected below were contained, but they were also evidence of how close the structure had come to total failure. As I stood in the control room that evening, watching the generator rotation timer tick down to its next scheduled shift, I understood something clearly. Sealing myself inside this complex had not guaranteed safety. It had simply transferred the problem from open exposure to internal attrition. The complex was not collapsing in dramatic fashion. It was eroding. And erosion is harder to fight than assault. Sublevel 4 was not mentioned casually inside the complex. Its name surfaced only when systems required explanation, or when sensor anomalies forced acknowledgement. It was located 2 structural levels beneath the primary operations floor, beyond a reinforced access corridor that had been sealed during the early days of containment. The official purpose of that level, according to archived schematics, was research storage and biological containment for classified projects. During the first week of the outbreak, that designation had shifted from theoretical preparedness to active crisis management. Dr. Rowe explained its history without dramatizing it. When the outbreak escalated beyond local hospital control, a small number of infected subjects had been transported to the complex under federal authorization. The assumption at the time was that controlled study might reveal intervention pathways. The facility's containment design included isolated chambers, negative pressure ventilation, and redundant blast barriers. In theory, it was capable of holding biological threats securely. In practice, the infection spread faster than the protocols anticipated. An internal security team was stationed on Sublevel 4 during the initial research period. When one of the infected subjects breached partial restraint, the response escalated rapidly. The infection did not behave predictably under sedation attempts, and personnel exposure occurred before full lockdown could be initiated. By the time upper command ordered the level sealed, several staff members were already compromised. The blast doors closed with both infected subjects and uninfected personnel still inside. They made the decision in under 30 seconds, Reyes told me. If they hadn't, the entire complex would have fallen that day. The cost of that decision was not abstract. Motion sensors embedded in the sealed corridor still registered occasional movement patterns weeks later. Power to that level had been cut except for essential environmental containment systems, but full sterilization was impossible without reopening the blast barrier. No one inside the upper tiers considered that option viable. As I reviewed the ventilation grid overlays, I saw the problem immediately. Even though Sublevel 4 had independent airflow loops, the long-term strain on shared exhaust routing created minor pressure instabilities. Those instabilities were part of the fluctuations I had observed earlier in generator output. The complex was compensating continuously for a sealed threat below it. Adrian added context that only someone involved in construction could provide. During the build phase, Sublevel 4 had been treated as an over-engineered redundancy, more political reassurance than practical necessity. Reinforced concrete walls extended deeper than standard federal specifications. Mechanical locks were designed to withstand external force, not sustained internal stress. The assumption had always been that containment events would be brief and controlled. No one had designed it for months of continuous pressure from within. Dr. Rowe maintained clinical detachment while discussing the decision to seal the level, but there was no mistaking the weight behind her words. She had been one of the researchers overseeing early containment attempts. Her choice to remain in the complex after evacuation efforts failed was not accidental. She believed she bore responsibility for what remained below. "We could have left," she said quietly while adjusting a monitor display, "but that would have meant abandoning the system entirely. If the blast doors ever failed without oversight, no one would know until it was too late." The ethical burden of Sublevel 4 extended beyond the infected. It represented the moment when the facility's purpose shifted permanently. Before that day, the complex had been a strategic refuge. After it, it became a sealed environment containing unresolved failure. I asked whether the sensors indicated organized movement or random activity. Reyes answered that patterns were inconsistent. Some days showed no activity at all. Other days registered clustered motion events along the internal corridor near the blast barrier. They had learned not to investigate further. Every inspection risked destabilizing a balance that, while imperfect, was holding. The existence of Sublevel 4 altered my understanding of the complex. We were not simply living inside a reinforced shelter, we were occupying the upper levels of a layered containment structure with an active threat beneath us. The design that preserved us also trapped something below that had never been fully neutralized. From an engineering standpoint, the solution was simple: maintain structural integrity, monitor load stress, conserve power. From a human standpoint, the reality was more complicated. The people sealed on Sublevel 4 had not volunteered for that outcome. They had been sacrificed to preserve the greater structure. That knowledge affected morale in subtle ways. Conversation about the lower level was limited. No one speculated aloud about whether anyone down there had survived beyond infection. No one discussed what might happen if the blast barrier degraded over time. Those questions existed, but they were contained as carefully as the level itself. As I returned to the operations room that evening, I understood that sealing myself inside this complex meant accepting its full reality. We were not isolated from the outbreak. We were layered above it. And below us, something remained that the structure had been forced to lock away rather than solve. The first time we heard it, none of us reacted immediately. The ventilation system in the complex had always produced a layered background noise, low mechanical hum from the filtration units, intermittent pressure equalization clicks, and the faint rush of air through segmented ducts. After several days inside, those sounds blended into something we no longer consciously tracked. What broke that pattern was not volume, but rhythm. It was a muted thud, followed by a pause, then another thud at uneven intervals. At first, I assumed it was structural settling amplified through the ductwork, especially given the stress the facility had endured. But when the third impact came from the same direction, Reyes looked up from the console and met my eyes without speaking. He had heard it too. The ventilation network was partially segmented by level. Sublevel 4 had its own negative pressure loop, but that loop still intersected at certain exhaust points with the broader system before being routed externally. If pressure valves malfunctioned or duct barriers degraded, limited physical access between zones could occur. The design prevented airflow contamination, but it did not make the duct system physically impenetrable under sustained force. Dr. Rowe muted one of the monitoring panels and isolated the audio feed from the lower-level ventilation grid. When the system amplified the sound, it became clearer. The thuds were not random vibrations. They were impacts against interior duct surfaces, traveling upward through metal shafts and echoing faintly into upper corridors. "That's not mechanical failure," Adrian said quietly. "No," I agreed. "It's force." We watched the airflow pressure readings fluctuate slightly in the corresponding sector. The negative pressure on sublevel 4 remained within acceptable margins, but minor variances suggested localized obstruction or repeated contact within the duct path. If something below had identified the airflow outlet as a source of movement or temperature difference, it could be interacting with it repeatedly. Reyes retrieved the corridor schematic and traced the likely duct route. The impacted line ran along a vertical shaft adjacent to a sealed access stairwell. The stairwell had been welded shut during the initial lockdown, but the ventilation channel ran beside it inside reinforced casing. "Could they reach it?" I asked. "Not without damaging internal grates," Adrian replied. "But those grates weren't designed for sustained battering." The question was not whether the infected below were intelligent enough to locate airflow as an exit route. It was whether repeated motion, random or instinctual, had aligned with the duct location and created opportunity over time. The impacts continued intermittently over the next hour. Not constant, but persistent. Each thud carried through the metal in a way that suggested proximity rather than distant structural shift. We decided to inspect the upper junction of the shaft, not the sealed lower section. Reyes and I moved down the corridor with controlled pace, maintaining low conversation. The complex lighting in that wing had been reduced to conserve energy, casting long shadows across reinforced walls. The ventilation access panel sat midway down the hall, secured by a bolted cover plate. When I pressed my palm lightly against the metal, I could feel faint vibration through it. It was subtle but real. Reyes stood beside me, rifle angled downward but ready. "We don't open it fully," he said. Agreed. I loosened one corner bolt carefully, just enough to create a narrow inspection gap without compromising the entire seal. A rush of warmer air escaped, followed by another muted thud from deeper within the shaft. The sound reverberated upward, clearer now that the panel had shifted slightly. Through the narrow opening, I could see the inner grate further down the vertical line. The metal showed faint distortion along one edge, not catastrophic, but visible. "They've been hitting it," Reyes said. "Or falling against it repeatedly," I replied. The distinction mattered less than the result. Sustained contact would weaken mounting points over time. If the inner grate failed, the shaft would provide vertical passage into higher corridors. We resealed the panel and tightened the bolts again, reinforcing the exterior bracket with additional fasteners from a nearby maintenance kit. It was not a permanent solution, but it redistributed stress along the mounting frame. Back in the control room, we recalibrated airflow slightly to reduce pressure draw through that specific line. Lower suction might make the duct less noticeable as an outlet, though it would also require balancing elsewhere in the system. Dr. Rowe observed the adjustments quietly before speaking. If Sublevel 4 containment weakens, we won't get a warning beyond this. I know, I said. The ventilation noise eventually returned to its baseline hum, but the thuds did not disappear entirely. They came sporadically through the remainder of the day, irregular enough that we could not predict them, steady enough that we could not ignore them. The complex had been designed to compartmentalize threats. Yet here we were, monitoring a physical interaction between levels that should never have intersected. The infected below did not need strategy. Time and repetition were sufficient. That night, as I reviewed system diagnostics one final time, I understood that erosion was occurring not just in fuel reserves or water pumps, but in the boundaries we depended on. The blast doors were solid, the concrete was reinforced, but the ventilation shafts, the smallest connective structures, represented vulnerability. And something beneath us had begun testing them. The conversation about food did not begin as an argument. It began as a calculation. Every few days, Adrian updated the inventory spreadsheet manually, cross-referencing dry storage with refrigerated reserves and medical supply logs. The complex had originally been stocked with sealed rations designed to sustain a limited number of officials and support staff for 30 days at full operational capacity. With population reduced to 4 and aggressive portion control from the beginning, those supplies had lasted far longer than anyone expected. But numbers lose generosity when stretched too thin for too long. By the time I arrived, they had already transitioned to a reduced calorie schedule. My inclusion altered the margin immediately, even though no one said so directly. Adrian placed the updated figures on the console and rotated the screen toward us. At current intake, he said evenly, we have 21 days. If we cut portions by another 15%, we extend to roughly 27. That assumes no spoilage and no mechanical failure in cold storage. And fuel? I asked. 17 days at current generator rotation, less if ventilation demands increase. The room was quiet for several seconds. The ventilation hum continued steadily, and the distant, intermittent thuds in the shaft remained faintly audible beneath it. Every system inside the complex was functioning, but each was functioning with diminishing reserve. Dr. Rowe folded her arms and leaned back against the workstation. We need to consider controlled retrieval, she said. There are supply depots within a 3-mile radius. If even one of them is intact, we could stabilize for another month. Reyes shook his head almost immediately. You've seen what's outside. It's not day 10 anymore. It's 4 months in. That also means density may have shifted, she replied. Early surges burn through resources quickly. Migration patterns change. She wasn't speculating recklessly. She was reasoning through epidemiological progression. Outbreaks do not maintain constant intensity in every zone. They flare, exhaust, redistribute. The perimeter is compromised, Reyes said. The outer fence is intact in sections, but we don't know herd movement patterns beyond that. I listened without interrupting at first. The logic for retrieval was sound from a resource standpoint. The risk was equally sound from a survival standpoint. The complex had held because it was sealed. Opening that seal for anything short of certainty would change the balance permanently. We need more information before deciding, I said finally. Not just optimism. Adrian nodded slightly. There are exterior camera arrays, he said. Most went offline during the early power reduction. but a few solar-fed units might still be functional. Reyes looked skeptical. If they were functional, we'd have noticed. Not if they're on independent cycle, Adrian replied. The discussion shifted from theory to verification. If exterior camera feeds could be reactivated without excessive power draw, we could assess local conditions without opening the blast door. It would not eliminate risk, but it would refine it. Later that afternoon, Adrian and I moved to the auxiliary communications bay. The system had been partially shut down to conserve energy. Restarting it required careful sequencing to avoid overloading battery reserves. We initiated a staggered reboot of the exterior feed interface, prioritizing the nearest perimeter angles. The first camera flickered to life slowly, its image grainy but visible. It displayed the western ridge beyond the outer fence. No visible movement. The second feed came online moments later, aimed toward what had once been a service road. The pavement was cracked and partially obstructed by abandoned vehicles. No active infected in view, though that meant little without broader context. The third feed remained dark. Panel likely damaged, Adrian said. We continued rotating through available channels. Some were irreparably offline. Others displayed static images of debris-strewn ground, overgrown brush, and distant structures. Not empty, Reyes said quietly, pointing to a cluster of movement at the edge of the final frame. It was subtle. Two figures crossing slowly along the tree line. Not sprinting, not swarming, moving in wandering patterns. The density appeared lower than urban footage I had seen during the early collapse. But lower did not mean absent. Dr. Rowe studied the feed carefully. If we time it correctly, she said, retrieval could be feasible. Feasible isn't safe, Reyes replied. No, she agreed, it isn't. The debate resumed, but with clearer boundaries now. Retrieval meant controlled exit through the outer blast corridor, navigation beyond the fence, and rapid return. It required fuel for vehicles that might no longer function properly. It required physical endurance none of us had tested in months. It also meant extending survival beyond a countdown. That evening we reduced meal portions by 10% as an interim measure. No one complained. Hunger in a controlled environment is easier to manage than fear in an open one. As I reviewed the numbers alone later that night, I understood the deeper tension behind the discussion. Rationing the future was not simply about dividing supplies. It was about deciding whether to continue preserving the structure or to risk it in pursuit of longevity. The complex had bought us time. Now time demanded a choice. The generator interruption began quietly, without any dramatic surge or visible malfunction. One moment the corridor lights were operating at their reduced but steady brightness, and the next they dimmed in a way that felt gradual rather than abrupt. The ventilation hum lowered in pitch before fading completely, and the monitors along the operations wall went dark one by one as the system failed to transfer load to the secondary unit. The change was noticeable not because it was loud, but because the constant mechanical background we had grown used to simply stopped. Emergency lighting activated after a short delay, casting a muted red tone across the room. The air inside the complex became still without circulation, and the absence of airflow made the space feel smaller. Adrian moved to the generator control panel immediately and began checking the transfer sequence manually. The automatic rotation between primary and secondary units had functioned consistently for months, but extended strain had likely degraded the synchronization board that managed the transition. He confirmed that the primary generator had shut down, but the secondary had not engaged. That left us operating entirely on emergency battery reserves. According to the display, those reserves could sustain essential systems for approximately 14 minutes before ventilation and environmental containment would begin shutting down in sequence. The implications were clear to all of us. Without active negative pressure reinforcement, The sealed lower levels would shift into passive containment mode. The structural blast doors would remain intact, but airflow differentials that help prevent pressure imbalance would no longer function as designed. As the ventilation system powered down fully, a series of dull impacts began traveling upward through the ductwork. Without the steady hum masking background noise, the sounds were easier to identify. The thuds were irregular but forceful, consistent with the intermittent activity we had already observed from Sublevel 4. The difference now was that the air pressure had changed. Whatever was below likely sensed that change through shifts in airflow or temperature. Reyes stepped into the corridor leading toward the sealed stairwell, maintaining visual inspection of the reinforced door at the end of the hall. He did not report structural breach, but he noted slight vibration along the frame consistent with the contact on the opposite side. It was impossible to determine whether the movement below had increased or whether we were simply more aware of it in the absence of ambient noise. Adrian activated the manual override mechanism designed for generator transfer failure. The system included a mechanical crank assembly that allowed the secondary unit to be engaged without automated synchronization. It required continuous rotation under load to build enough momentum for ignition. I assisted him, and together we applied steady force while monitoring the battery timer. The emergency display continued counting down in measured increments. Dr. Rowe monitored environmental readings, confirming that oxygen levels remained stable but were gradually declining without circulation. The temperature inside the operations room rose slightly as air remained stagnant. The impacts within the ventilation shaft persisted, but did not escalate beyond what we had previously documented. Reyes remained stationed near the corridor, reporting no change in the integrity of the stairwell barrier. The reinforced structure was holding. After several minutes of manual rotation, the secondary generator began responding. The ignition sequence engaged unevenly at first, then stabilized into operational rhythm. Overhead lighting returned gradually to its normal reduced intensity, and the ventilation system restarted with a brief surge before settling into its steady hum. Negative pressure controls reactivated automatically, restoring airflow balance between levels. The entire interruption lasted 14 minutes. System diagnostics indicated that the failure originated in the automatic transfer circuitry, likely due to cumulative stress from extended operation beyond design parameters. The manual override had functioned as intended, but reliance on that method was not sustainable if repeated frequently. Once power stabilized, we conducted a structured review of generator logs and containment metrics. No breach occurred during the outage, and Sublevel 4's blast barrier remained intact. However, the incident demonstrated how narrow the operational margin had become. The complex was capable of sustaining life, but only through continuous intervention and careful management of aging systems. There was no argument afterward about the seriousness of the situation. The power interruption did not create immediate catastrophe, but it clarified the vulnerability inherent in prolonged isolation. The facility had been built to endure crisis temporarily. We were extending it into duration. That distinction mattered more after those 14 minutes than it had before. The morning after the generator failure, we conducted a full diagnostic sweep of the lower-level monitoring systems. The blast barrier to Sublevel 4 had not physically opened during the power interruption, and the locking bolts remained engaged according to the primary display. However, the structural stress readings along the adjacent corridor were inconsistent with previous baselines. The outage had interrupted negative pressure flow long enough to create measurable variance in the containment shaft that connected to the lower access junction. Adrian overlaid historical sensor data with the current readout and pointed out a narrow deviation along the eastern hinge assembly of the blast door. The shift was not large, but it had not been present before. The reinforced barrier had absorbed impact pressure for months, and during the 14-minute lapse, the internal load had redistributed unevenly. Reyes and I prepared to inspect the upper access corridor without opening the primary seal. The route required passing through 2 internal security doors before reaching the final reinforced junction that overlooked Sublevel 4's stairwell landing. The corridor lighting in that section had been reduced to conserve power, and the walls carried visible marks from previous emergency welding during the early lockdown. As we approached the final barrier, the ventilation hum was steady, and no immediate abnormal sounds were detectable. The inspection window embedded in the blast door was small and reinforced with layered ballistic glass. It allowed limited visual confirmation of the landing beyond. Reyes positioned himself slightly to the side while I leaned towards the window. The first thing I noticed was that the lower corridor lights were not fully dark. Emergency backup lighting on Sublevel 4 had reactivated automatically when the generator restarted, casting a dim amber glow along the landing. The second thing I noticed was movement. 2 figures stood within visible range of the lower stairwell. Their posture was unsteady but upright. The uniforms they wore were consistent with federal security staff. The fabric was torn and discolored, but the insignia remained faintly visible on one sleeve. They were not moving randomly. They were positioned near the inner blast barrier on the lower level, facing upward toward the sealed stairwell. Reyes exhaled slowly. They're closer than before. Prior sensor logs had shown motion distributed deeper within the sublevel corridors. The fact that the infected were now congregating near the upper landing suggested a shift in pressure patterns or awareness during the outage. The temporary cessation of airflow may have drawn them toward the barrier. As we observed, one of the figures lifted its arm and struck the lower door surface with measurable force. The impact did not compromise the seal, but the hinge alignment appeared slightly misaligned compared to archived imagery. We returned to the operations room and reported the visual confirmation. Dr. Rowe listened without interrupting. Her expression controlled, but visibly affected by the confirmation that former colleagues remained in that state below. Adrian examined the hinge deviation data more closely. The blast door itself was not failing, but the secondary pressure gasket along the right seam had compressed unevenly. Over time, repeated internal impact combined with mechanical stress from airflow fluctuation could weaken that seam. "We need to reinforce from this side," he said. The reinforcement procedure required adding external steel bracing along the upper hinge mount and redistributing load across the corridor frame. It was not a simple bolt-on solution. It required careful measurement to avoid altering door balance. Reyes and I gathered the necessary equipment from the engineering bay. While we worked, intermittent impacts continued from below, though not continuously. The sound carried faintly through the reinforced structure, more noticeable now that we had visually confirmed the source. The installation process took nearly an hour. We secured additional brackets along the hinge assembly and anchored them into the corridor wall with reinforced fasteners designed for structural stabilization. The goal was not to improve containment indefinitely, but to extend the tolerance threshold. Throughout the procedure, we did not open the barrier. We relied entirely on external reinforcement. When we finished, Adrian recalibrated the structural monitoring system. The hinge deviation reduced slightly under redistributed load. It was not a permanent fix, but it restored acceptable safety margin. Back in the operations room, Dr. Rowe reviewed the visual feed we had captured from the inspection window. She did not linger on it. The footage served a practical purpose: confirmation of proximity and behavior pattern. The generator failure had not opened Sublevel 4, but it had altered the internal equilibrium enough to shift infected movement closer to the upper boundary. That movement represented adaptation in the simplest sense. Changes in airflow, temperature, or sound had drawn them upward. The complex remained sealed. But the separation between levels was no longer static. It was being tested over time. The reinforcement of the Sublevel 4 hinge assembly restored structural margin, but it did not resolve the underlying tension that had been building since the generator failure. The infected below were closer to the upper boundary than they had been in previous weeks, and the power interruption had demonstrated how dependent containment was on uninterrupted system function. In the days that followed, the facility returned to its reduced but steady rhythm. Generator rotation resumed under tighter supervision, airflow balance was recalibrated, and meal portions were adjusted again to compensate for extended duration. Outwardly, nothing dramatic changed. The shift came during a routine data review. Dr. Rowe requested that I assist her in examining archived outbreak logs stored in the internal research database. The files were part of the initial containment effort that had taken place on Sublevel 4 during the first weeks of the collapse. She accessed them with deliberate hesitation, as though reopening material she had avoided revisiting in full. The early entries documented symptom progression among the infected subjects transported to the complex. At the time, federal response teams had still operated under the assumption that controlled observation could yield therapeutic intervention. The infected were restrained, monitored, and exposed to a series of antiviral compounds and sedatives. Vital sign charts, neural activity scans, and behavioral notes filled the logs. I read through the progression timelines carefully. The initial incubation window recorded during those first weeks averaged between 6 and 8 hours following exposure. Neurological degradation followed quickly, accompanied by increased aggression and loss of voluntary motor control. That pattern had been widely observed in the early days of the outbreak. What changed? I asked. Dr. Rowe paused before answering. She retrieved a later log set from approximately 30 days after the initial containment attempts. These entries were more fragmented, compiled under deteriorating conditions as staffing levels dropped. The incubation period in those later cases had shortened. Some subjects exhibited full neurological transition in under 4 hours. That wasn't widely broadcast, she said quietly. By the time we confirmed the trend, communication infrastructure had already collapsed. The virus was not static. It was adapting. The later logs indicated further deviation. Tissue response markers suggested increased resistance to certain sedatives that had previously slowed motor function. The pathogen did not appear to mutate randomly, but its progression timeline accelerated under certain environmental conditions. I reviewed the data twice before speaking. If incubation time continues to shorten, retrieval missions become more dangerous than we calculated. Yes, she said. The secret was not that the virus had originated in a lab, or that it had been engineered deliberately. The data did not support that conclusion. What she had withheld was the evolving nature of its progression. Early public health models assumed a relatively fixed infection window. Those assumptions no longer held by the time Sublevel 4 was sealed. She explained that she had not shared the updated timeline earlier because it did not alter immediate containment strategy inside the complex. The facility was sealed. Exposure risk internally was minimal, as long as barriers held. However, any external excursion beyond the blast doors would carry greater danger than the original outbreak models predicted. Reyes needs to know, I said. He will, she replied. That evening we briefed the others in the operations room. Adrian absorbed the information in silence, mentally recalculating risk factors. Reyes listened without interruption, his posture steady but attentive. So, if we get scratched, we have less time than we thought, he summarized. Potentially, Dr. Rowe confirmed, and sedative countermeasures are less reliable than early reports suggested. The information altered the balance of our earlier retrieval discussion. A shortened incubation window meant less opportunity for observation and intervention in case of exposure. It reduced margin for error during any external operation. The secret was not catastrophic revelation, it was incremental degradation. The virus had not transformed into something entirely new. It had refined its efficiency. As we reviewed the archive footage from Sublevel 4, I noticed that later stage infected exhibited more coordinated movement than the earliest recordings. Not intelligence in a strategic sense, but improved motor alignment and sustained stamina. That evolution aligned with the physical testing we had observed at the ventilation shaft and blast barrier. The pathogen was not weakening over time, it was stabilizing. After the briefing concluded, Dr. Rowe remained seated in the operations room while the rest of us dispersed. She did not appear defensive about withholding the information earlier. Instead, she seemed resigned to the reality that research without infrastructure was incomplete. The complex had given her controlled data for a short period. After that, survival took precedence over analysis. The updated infection timeline did not immediately change our actions inside the facility. It did, however, reshape the framework for every future decision involving external contact. If we left the complex, we would not be facing the same outbreak that began 120 days earlier. We would be facing a version that had already adjusted to its environment. Reyes had been compensating for his injury since before I arrived, and for a while he managed it without drawing attention to the strain. The wound had originated during the early containment breach months earlier when he helped reseal an interior corridor after infected personnel reached the upper level. At the time, the injury had seemed survivable with proper care. Limited antibiotics and controlled rest had allowed him to remain mobile, though never fully stable. Over time, however, extended duty shifts and the physical demands of maintaining the facility began to erode whatever healing had taken place. The change became undeniable after the generator failure and subsequent reinforcement work on the Sublevel 4 barrier. Reyes participated in both tasks without hesitation, but the added strain aggravated the injury beyond its previous baseline. By the following week, he began leaning more heavily on corridor railings and limiting his patrol routes to shorter intervals. He did not complain, but the effort required to maintain his composure was visible. Dr. Rowe conducted a thorough examination in the medical bay using the remaining diagnostic equipment. The infection risk from the original wound had never been completely eliminated due to constrained antibiotic supply. What she found was not a new viral exposure, but progressive tissue damage and inflammation exacerbated by chronic overuse. Without access to surgical intervention or advanced medication, treatment options were limited to immobilization and pain management. Immobilization inside a complex with compromised lower-level containment was not a minor adjustment. Adrian reviewed the patrol schedule while Reyes sat quietly in the operations chair, listening without interrupting. The facility's internal inspection routes required at least 2 people for safety. If Reyes could no longer navigate corridors reliably, the workload would fall unevenly on the remaining 3 of us. "I can still handle control room oversight," Reyes said evenly when the topic surfaced. "I don't need to be on corridor duty." His tone was steady, but the implication was clear. He understood what the injury meant. We restructured responsibilities that evening. Adrian and I assumed alternating corridor checks, while Dr. Rowe focused exclusively on medical and environmental monitoring. Reyes remained stationed at the central console, managing surveillance feeds and communication logs. From a functional standpoint, the adjustment was manageable. From a psychological standpoint, it shifted the internal balance of the group. Reyes had been the only active military presence inside the complex. His training shaped our security posture, even when not explicitly acknowledged. With his mobility reduced, the burden of immediate response fell elsewhere. The infection data Dr. Rowe had shared earlier in the week added complexity to the situation. Any external retrieval mission now carried higher risk due to shortened incubation timelines. If Reyes could not accompany such a mission, our operational capacity diminished further. One evening, after Adrian and I completed a corridor inspection, I found Reyes reviewing exterior camera feeds with unusual intensity. He was studying movement patterns along the tree line beyond the fence, likely calculating how long it would take to traverse the perimeter on limited mobility. You don't have to, I said quietly. He did not look away from the screen. It's not about pride, he replied. It's about redundancy. If one of you gets exposed, someone has to maintain containment. He was not exaggerating. The facility depended on layered responsibility. Removing even one active participant strained that structure. Over the next several days, Reyes's condition worsened incrementally. Swelling around the injured leg increased despite rest. Dr. Rowe rationed anti-inflammatory medication carefully, aware that the supply could not be replenished. She avoided framing the situation in dire terms, but the trajectory was evident. The discussion no one wanted to initiate surfaced gradually rather than abruptly. If Reyes lost full mobility, he would be unable to retreat quickly during a containment breach. In the worst-case scenario, he could become a liability during evacuation or structural failure. None of us framed it that way directly, but the awareness lingered in our planning conversations. Reyes addressed it before anyone else did. If the lower level breaches and I can't move, he said during one of our evening reviews, you seal the corridor behind me. There was no dramatics in his voice, only procedural clarity. Dr. Rowe met his gaze without hesitation. That's not a decision we're making tonight, she said. He nodded once, acknowledging her authority, while not retracting the statement. The reality was that prolonged isolation had already forced us into scenarios that would have seemed unthinkable months earlier. Sealing Sublevel 4 with personnel still inside had been one such decision. The difference now was proximity. Reyes's injury did not create immediate crisis. He remained functional within the control room, his judgment steady and his awareness sharp. However, his reduced mobility narrowed our margin further. The complex was still operational, but each system relied increasingly on fewer capable bodies. In the days that followed, we adjusted again. Patrol routes were shortened. Inspection frequency was modified to balance security with physical strain. Meals were redistributed slightly to support Reyes' recovery, though the benefit was limited. The facility had been designed for continuity of governance. It was now dependent on continuity of 4 individuals, one of whom was gradually losing the ability to move through it. The problem was not dramatic. It was incremental. An incremental decline was becoming a pattern inside the complex. The signal appeared during a routine communications sweep that Adrian conducted every 48 hours. The complex maintained a long-range receiver capable of scanning military and federal emergency frequencies, though for months the channels had been either silent or filled with degraded static. Most structured communication had ceased within the first few weeks of the outbreak, replaced by fragmented transmissions that eventually tapered into nothing. That afternoon, the receiver locked onto a repeating broadcast. The message was automated, transmitted in a consistent loop with standardized cadence. It identified itself as a federal emergency relocation directive and provided coordinates for a designated safe corridor several hundred miles east of our location. The audio quality was clean, suggesting the transmission originated from a stable relay tower rather than a mobile unit. We gathered in the operations room while the message played again. The directive referenced evacuation staging zones, medical triage support, and military escort units. It sounded like something recorded within the first 10 days of collapse, when federal authorities were still attempting organized relocation. The timestamp embedded in the digital metadata confirmed that suspicion. The broadcast file had not been updated in over 3 months. It's a ghost transmission, Adrian said quietly. Reyes leaned forward in his chair, studying the signal strength indicator. Is it local? He asked. Repeater chain, Adrian replied, probably cycling through surviving towers automatically. Dr. Rowe listened without speaking. Her attention focused on the phrasing of the message itself. The coordinates listed had once been a major evacuation route along a controlled access highway system. In the early days of the outbreak, That corridor had likely become congested with civilians attempting to flee urban centers. The fact that the transmission continued to loop did not imply active coordination at the destination. It suggested only that the broadcasting infrastructure had not yet failed completely. If someone heard this without context, I said, they might assume there's still organized response. Reyes nodded and head straight into whatever's waiting. The broadcast repeated again, unchanged. It instructed listeners to move immediately toward the relocation point and warned against remaining in isolated residential areas. The guidance was logical within the first week of collapse. After 120 days, its relevance was uncertain at best. We debated whether to attempt contact. The transmitter was automated, but there was a possibility that a monitoring station existed somewhere within the network. Attempting outbound transmission, however, carried risk. The complex's external antenna array had been partially deactivated to conserve power. Reactivating it would increase energy draw and potentially broadcast our location more widely than intended. Adrian adjusted the receiver sensitivity to determine whether the signal strength fluctuated. It remained consistent, indicating that the source was either distant but stable or routed through multiple automated relays. There was no evidence of real-time human response embedded in the loop. Dr. Rowe eventually broke the silence. "This doesn't mean there's nothing functioning elsewhere," she said carefully, "but it doesn't mean there is." The distinction mattered. For months, we had operated under the assumption that organized federal continuity efforts had failed beyond our facility. The automated transmission suggested that some infrastructure remained intact, though whether it was actively staffed was impossible to determine from a repeating message. Reyes shifted slightly in his chair, adjusting his injured leg. "If we leave here eventually, that corridor might be worth assessing," he said. "Or it might be the worst possible direction," Adrian replied. The discussion did not escalate into argument. It remained measured, analytical. The broadcast provided data, not instruction. We logged the coordinates and recorded the signal strength for reference, then reduced the receiver to passive monitoring mode. That night, the message continued looping in my thoughts. Not because it promised rescue, but because it represented something we had not encountered in weeks. Structured communication. Even if outdated, it carried the rhythm of organized response. The complex had preserved us physically, but it had isolated us informationally. The automated transmission reminded us that other systems might still be functioning in fragments beyond our perimeter. Whether those fragments represented opportunity or danger remained unresolved. By morning, the broadcast was still transmitting. We did not answer it, but we did not ignore it either. The transmission did not immediately change our situation, but it altered the direction of our planning. Until that point, every discussion about leaving the complex had been hypothetical, framed around resource depletion or catastrophic failure. The broadcast introduced a different variable. The possibility, however uncertain, that organized infrastructure still existed beyond our isolation. Whether that infrastructure was functional or merely residual automation remained unclear, but the existence of a signal meant the outside world was not entirely silent. At the same time, our internal reserves continued to narrow. Fuel projections were decreasing despite tighter rotation schedules, and food supplies were approaching thresholds that would force either severe rationing or external retrieval. Reyes's mobility had not improved significantly, which meant any operation beyond the perimeter would rely on Adrian and me, with Dr. Rowe remaining inside to maintain containment oversight. We decided first to conduct a limited surface inspection without committing to full departure. The objective was simple: assess immediate perimeter stability, evaluate vehicle viability, and determine infected density within visible range. If conditions were untenable, we would retreat immediately. The outer blast corridor had not been opened in weeks. As we powered the hydraulic release system, The mechanism responded with resistance, but ultimately disengaged. The interior air pressure shifted slightly as the first barrier opened, revealing the secondary reinforced gate that led to the surface compound. Adrian and I equipped ourselves with minimal but practical gear. We avoided unnecessary weight to preserve mobility. Dr. Rowe remained at the operations console, monitoring internal sensors and maintaining communication through short-range headsets. Reyes positioned himself at the internal control override panel, ready to reseal the corridor if necessary. When the final surface gate lifted, natural light entered the compound in a way that felt unfamiliar after prolonged exposure to artificial illumination. The exterior air carried the scent of dust and vegetation rather than decay. The overgrowth around the perimeter fencing had advanced noticeably, suggesting limited large-scale movement in recent weeks. We moved slowly toward the outer checkpoint area, scanning tree line and road access points before committing further. The abandoned vehicles near the fence remained in place. One of the service trucks appeared structurally intact, though its fuel level and mechanical condition were unknown. Through the headset, Dr. Rowe reported no unusual internal readings. The complex remained stable during the partial opening. As we advanced beyond the fence line briefly to gain wider visual range, we observed scattered, infected movement along the distant roadway. The density appeared lower than early outbreak footage I had seen months earlier, but individuals were still present, moving without coordination across open ground. We did not approach them. Instead, we evaluated the service truck. Adrian checked the fuel gauge first. The tank was below half capacity, but not empty. The battery retained minimal charge, enough for ignition attempt. We did not start the engine yet. The noise would carry, and we were not prepared for pursuit. The primary objective was observation, not engagement. From the elevated ridge beyond the compound, we could see a wider section of the surrounding area. Several structures in the distance showed signs of fire damage, similar to what we had experienced at the complex perimeter. Smoke was not visible anywhere within range. There were no signs of organized human activity, no patrol vehicles, no visible encampments, no coordinated movement. The environment did not resemble the immediate chaos of the first weeks. It resembled abandonment punctuated by scattered motion. We returned to the compound without incident and lowered the surface gate carefully. Once sealed, we conducted a full containment check to confirm that no external exposure had occurred during the brief opening. Internal systems remained stable. Back in the operations room, we reviewed what we had observed. The outside was not overrun to the degree we had feared, but it was not secure. Movement existed, though dispersed. Vehicles were potentially viable. The transmission coordinates lay beyond visible range, requiring commitment to sustained travel. The surface inspection did not answer whether we should leave the complex permanently. It clarified that leaving was possible, but not simple. The complex had preserved us for 120 days. Its systems were strained but functional. Outside, risk was visible but not overwhelming in immediate proximity. The decision ahead would not be forced by sudden collapse. It would be deliberate. And deliberation under our circumstances required precision rather than urgency. After the surface inspection, the atmosphere inside the complex shifted in a way that was difficult to define, but impossible to ignore. We had confirmed that the outside world was not in immediate, overwhelming chaos within visible range, and that knowledge altered the psychological balance of our isolation. For months, the facility had felt like a necessary enclosure protecting us from constant external threat. Now it began to feel more like a containment structure that was gradually limiting our options. The structural reports did not improve in the days that followed. Adrian identified additional strain along one of the water filtration junctions, likely the result of extended load distribution after the tertiary pump failure earlier in the timeline. The workaround we had implemented was still holding, but the margin for mechanical error was narrowing. Replacement components remained stored in the compromised annex we had avoided since the early breach. Retrieving them would require passing through a section of corridor that had once been exposed to infected movement. Fuel calculations were also approaching a point where conservative rotation would no longer be sufficient. Even with reduced lighting and partial system shutdowns in non-essential areas, the generators were operating beyond the duration they had been designed to support without maintenance overhaul. We could stretch reserves slightly by limiting ventilation cycles further, but that would increase pressure fluctuation in lower containment areas, particularly around Sublevel 4. The infected below had not breached the blast barrier, but intermittent motion near the upper landing continued. The reinforcement we installed along the hinge assembly reduced visible deviation, yet it did not eliminate stress accumulation. The complex was holding together through intervention, not stability. Food reserves reached the point where further rationing would compromise physical capacity rather than extend meaningful time. Dr. Rowe adjusted caloric intake again, but the reduction was modest. Any deeper cut would weaken us before it preserved us. It became clear that the complex had fulfilled its original purpose. It had preserved a small group of people during the most volatile phase of collapse. It had allowed time for infection density to redistribute, for external fires to burn out, and for immediate chaos to subside. But it had not been constructed to become a permanent settlement. The absence of supply chains and the cumulative degradation of systems were converging toward inevitability. Reyes addressed the issue directly one evening during operations review. His mobility remained limited, though manageable within the control room. "If we stay until fuel is gone," he said evenly, "we lose the option to leave under our own control." No one disagreed. The automated transmission continued to cycle through the receiver at scheduled intervals. We logged its persistence but had not responded. The coordinates it provided remained distant but reachable with functioning transport. Adrian reviewed the service truck diagnostics we had collected during the surface inspection. The engine required maintenance but was operable. Fuel could be siphoned from one of the abandoned vehicles near the ridge to extend range modestly. Beyond that, resupply would depend on what we encountered along the route. Dr. Rowe weighed the medical implications. With shortened incubation timelines and reduced treatment capacity, exposure during travel carried heightened risk. Remaining inside, however, meant gradual decline under a mechanical attrition. The complex was not failing catastrophically. It was wearing down in layers. Each subsystem required more oversight than the last. Each repair consumed tools and materials that could not be replaced. When I reviewed the facility schematics one final time, I saw it clearly. The design was layered around temporary continuity, preserve leadership, maintain command structure, re-establish order externally. It had never been intended as an indefinite refuge for a self-contained population without broader infrastructure support. We had mistaken durability for permanence. The question was no longer whether the complex could hold. It was whether holding served any strategic purpose beyond delaying an inevitable decision. By the end of that week, we agreed to prepare for departure. Not immediately, not impulsively, but methodically. We catalogued what could be transported safely and what would need to be left behind. Essential medical supplies were prioritized. Portable communication equipment was tested and recalibrated. Fuel reserves were consolidated for vehicle use rather than generator rotation. Reyes would remain inside only long enough to coordinate final shutdown procedures. If departure occurred, the complex would be sealed one last time, this time without expectation of return. The facility had preserved us during the most dangerous surge of the outbreak. It had done exactly what it was engineered to do. What it could not do was rebuild the world beyond its walls. And we had reached the point where preservation without movement no longer served survival. We did not leave on impulse. The decision was implemented over several structured days, each one dedicated to reducing reliance on the systems that had sustained us. Fuel that would normally feed the generators was transferred carefully into portable containers. Non-essential lighting sectors were shut down permanently. Data archives were compressed onto a portable storage unit in case Dr. Rowe's research notes proved relevant beyond the complex. The facility that had been our entire environment for months began transitioning from active habitat to sealed structure. Reyes coordinated the shutdown sequence from the operations console with deliberate precision. Even with limited mobility, his understanding of the system architecture remained sharp. Generator rotation was reduced to minimal cycle while we prepared the surface vehicle. Environmental controls for Sublevel 4 were set to passive long-duration containment mode. The blast barrier hinge reinforcement we had installed would hold for as long as structural fatigue allowed, but once we left, no one would be monitoring deviations. The morning of departure, the complex felt different, not because anything dramatic had occurred, but because our relationship to it had changed. For 120 days, every decision revolved around sustaining the structure. Now the structure was something we were preparing to abandon. The service truck had been moved inside the perimeter during the previous inspection and parked within the outer compound to minimize exposure time on departure. Adrian had completed basic engine maintenance using tools salvaged from the mechanical bay. The fuel siphoned from abandoned vehicles was secured in reinforced containers, giving us extended range but not unlimited distance. Dr. Rose sealed her workstation last. She powered down the research terminals and removed only the most critical files. The remainder of the complex data would remain stored within internal servers, inaccessible unless someone else found and reactivated the facility. Reyes insisted on performing the final internal sweep despite his injury. Adrian assisted him through the shortened corridor route, confirming that all non-essential systems were offline and that interior doors were sealed. When they returned to the operations room, Reyes initiated the final sequence. The primary generator shut down first, followed by auxiliary lighting in upper sectors. Emergency backup systems remained active long enough to allow us to exit through the blast corridor without fully disabling containment integrity. Sublevel 4's barrier status indicator remained green as we passed the monitor one last time. No one spoke about what remained below. The outer blast door opened slowly, releasing natural light into the corridor in a way that felt unfamiliar again. The air outside was cool and still. There was no immediate movement along the tree line. The compound remained as we had last seen it, overgrown and quiet. We loaded the remaining supplies into the truck with measured efficiency. Dr. Rowe took the passenger seat beside Adrian, who would drive. Reyes settled into the back seat, his legs supported by makeshift bracing to prevent further strain. I remained at the blast door controls until the others were inside. Before sealing the corridor from the exterior panel, I looked back down the length of the facility one final time. The complex had preserved us through the most volatile months of collapse. It had provided shelter when the outside world was unmanageable. But it had never been designed to serve as a new beginning. I initiated the closure sequence. The blast door descended into place, sealing the interior behind reinforced steel. Without generator power, the facility would remain dormant but intact, its systems slowly draining until complete shutdown. The truck engine started without hesitation. The sound carried farther than any noise we had allowed inside the complex for months. Adrian guided the vehicle toward the service road, avoiding debris and damaged fencing. As we cleared the perimeter ridge, the compound receded from view. The landscape beyond was neither empty nor overtaken entirely. Scattered, infected figures moved along distant roadways, dispersed rather than clustered. Structures stood damaged but not universally destroyed. The world was altered, but not erased. 147 days after the outbreak began, we were no longer sealed inside reinforced walls. The complex had given us time, but time alone was not survival. Movement was now part of the equation. We drove east, not because the automated transmission guaranteed safety, but because remaining stationary inside a diminishing structure no longer served purpose. The future ahead was uncertain, but it was active rather than contained. The emergency complex remained behind us, sealed and silent, having fulfilled the only role it was ever meant to serve.